week ago, I did a video on the hardest locations in Resident Evil games. Before that, about a month ago, I did the hardest Resident Evil boss fights. Today, however, I think it's finally time we take a look at the games as a whole. Which Resident Evil game overall is the hardest to beat? I guess I want to start off by saying that Resident Evil games are not exactly the most difficult games out there to begin with. With that being said, there are some extremely irritating moments in the series that just makes us destroy our new PlayStation controller. Yeah, those moments suck. So as always, let's start with some rules. Firstly, I'm looking at each of these games from a single player perspective. I feel like that's the easiest way to keep things fair in terms of difficulty for this list. Also, there are a few spin-offs in the series that I haven't played yet. For example, Resident Evil Gaiden. So to kind of narrow down the list of possible candidates, I'm looking at mainly the canon entries of the series. Meaning, the possible games that could appear on this list include the numbered entries, the remakes, the Revelation games, Code Veronica, the Resident Evil Outbreak files, and even the Chronicle games. Finally, I'm looking at the most difficult mode in each game without using unlimited ammo or unique bonus weapons unlocked after completing the main game. So yeah, no infinite rocket launcher, no riding gun, no Chicago typewriter. You get the drill. Sorry guys, we just have to keep this list as fair as possible. So we know the rules and we know the candidates for this list. I think we're ready. Oh, one more thing. Don't forget to leave a like on this video and subscribe for more ranking videos just like this one. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games and this is the top 10 hardest Resident Evil games to beat on the hardest difficulty. Let's get it. Number 10, The Umbrella Chronicles.
Welcome to the Umbrella Chronicles. Accessing file number 249811149RC.
Biohazard. The outbreak occurred in the summer of 1998.
Okay, so straight up, Umbrella Chronicles is probably the one game on this list that people might disagree with me the most. As far as I was able to find, not many people out there find this game to be that difficult. And you know what? I respect those of you that don't find this game hard in the slightest. For me though, I fucking hate this game. Maybe it's because I just suck at on-rail shooters.
What in the hell?
Watch the fangs, I bet they're poisonous!
Even if they aren't, if that thing gets a hold of us, we're screwed. Get around it and keep your distance.
Right!
But this game is no joke, especially on the harder difficulty. Hell, I found myself dying a lot on just the normal difficulty. That's how much trouble this game gave me. And for me, the biggest issue I had was trying to land critical hits. I was not good at aiming at all, and the transitions between scenes really took a toll on me to the point where I found myself getting pretty dizzy. A lot. As for why Umbrella Chronicles cracks the top 10 hardest Resident Evil games and not Darkside Chronicles, well, it comes down to two things. Firstly, the animation and transitions in Umbrella Chronicles made it more difficult for me to stay focused. I found myself really having more trouble aiming here than I did in Darkside Chronicles. Not sure why, but that's just how it felt for me. However, the bigger issue comes down to one of the most difficult boss fights in Resident Evil as a whole, the Ivan twins.
Stand aside.
Oh, I almost forgot. Here are a few of my old friends I'd like to introduce you to.
Charmed.
Now, these guys didn't make my list for the hardest Resident Evil bosses because on that list I wasn't focusing on games outside of the mainline series. But if I was, these guys would have cracked that list. Trying to take them both down while shooting down missiles and preventing damage is a huge pain in the ass. I think I've died more times in this one boss encounter than I did throughout the entire game. Do not underestimate these guys. Number 9, Resident Evil 5.
Look out!
Resident Evil 5 is definitely one of the more action-focused games of the series. With that being said, it's also one of the more difficult games to complete in the franchise, especially if you play on professional. Now, remember that we are looking at this game from the perspective that we're not allowed to use bonuses to complete the playthrough. meaning no unlimited ammo or gallon gun or anything else unlocked via bonuses. So with all of this in mind, what makes completing Resident Evil 5 on Professional so difficult? Well, there's a few things. Firstly, the enemies are much harder to deal with than previous installments. Up until Resident Evil 4, most enemies were just zombies or animal-like creatures that didn't have much range. However, thanks to the new direction introduced by Resident Evil 4, we now saw enemies with guns and dynamite and other weapons that can do major damage to us at a distance. Also, Resident Evil 5 brought back the instant kill chainsaw enemies from Resident Evil 4 and even introduced a new instant kill enemy known as the Reaper. These bug-like creatures are a pain in the ass to kill, and if you get too close to them, well, it's game over. Add that to the large amount of boss encounters that each add a distinct level of difficulty. Irving, in my opinion, is one of the hardest bosses in the series to deal with.
Won't you two just die already? You're making me look bad. Who do you think got this entire operation off the ground? Research like this doesn't fund itself, you know.
The second test subject in the lab drained resources like crazy. Even something as simple as the Wesker and Jill fight on solo play was kind of hard. However, the biggest issue with trying to complete this game solo on Professional comes down to your partner's AI. Okay, so all of you Sheva defenders and lovers out there, now's your chance to go ahead, throw the tomatoes, pull out the pitchforks against me, because here I am to talk some shit about Sheva's AI. While it's still manageable, Sheva as your partner ultimately finds herself in some really troublesome situations. Seriously, I think I got more game overs thanks to Sheva dying than I did from me actually dying. In Sheva's defense specifically, if you were to play as Sheva instead of Chris, you would have the same problem. The only difference is that for your first playthrough, you are forced to play as Chris, so that's why people usually put the blame on Sheva first before Chris. Sorry, Sheva. Still, this game doesn't move higher up on this list due to one specific flaw that makes the playthrough much easier: the rocket launcher. Now, as I mentioned, we can't use bonus weapons to complete the harder difficulties. That's not allowed. That being said, the rocket launcher isn't a bonus weapon technically in Resident Evil 5 or even Resident Evil 4. See, if you, the player, has enough cash for them, you can buy one over and over again as soon as you use it. Meaning, you can turn some of the most difficult boss fights in this game into a child's game, basically. Sure, some of them can't be beat with one rocket launcher. Hell, the Indesu, if I'm pronouncing that right, doesn't even allow you to use rocket launchers at all. For that reason, and the fact that this game has more difficult enemies overall, and your partner's awful AI, this game still cracks the list for most difficult games in the series though.
In less than 5 minutes, we'll reach the optimal altitude for missile deployment. Ouroboros will be released into the atmosphere, ensuring complete global saturation.
Number 8, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. So fun fact, Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2, well, they were not hard games. I know, crazy, right? We can try to defend them as much as we want, but those games were not that difficult to complete. Now that doesn't take away from how amazing they were, but up until that point, Resident Evil showed us that the hardest part about those games was just trying to push through our fear and complete them. That all changed with the Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, in my opinion. See, I personally feel like Nemesis really ups the difficulty in just about every single way compared to the games that came before it. Let's start with the most obvious one, Nemesis.
Stars.
Taking something that worked in Resident Evil 2's Scenario B mode with Mr. X and turning it into a full game essentially was probably one of the most brilliant decisions Capcom made regarding Resident Evil 3. Having Nemesis pop up randomly in some of the most unexpected moments throughout the game really added a new layer of fear and difficulty. Players were forced to decide if they should take a few hits and run from this monster each time, or just go guns blazing and put him down for that special reward. Each encounter with Nemesis grew more and more difficult as the game went on, with one of the encounters, the Clock Tower boss fight, being one of the hardest in the series. Not only was this monster extremely fast, but he also had an arsenal big enough to supply a full squad of soldiers. Nemesis isn't the only thing that made this game hard though. The Gravedigger boss fight is a pain in the ass to deal with.
What's going on? Whoa! What was that?
The normal monsters that we've encountered in previous games felt more aggressive in this game. The locations were more narrow, making it harder to avoid attacks from enemies. Oh, and how can we talk about Resident Evil 3 being a hard game without bringing up the extremely difficult puzzles in this game? Seriously, the water sample puzzle is still by far one of the hardest puzzles in the entire series. All of these elements combine to make for one extremely difficult Resident Evil game.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
Number 7, Resident Evil 2 Remake.
Jesus, stay back!
The original Resident Evil 2 game was never really that difficult to complete, like I mentioned earlier, and Capcom probably already knew that going into Resident Evil 2's remake. That's because Resident Evil 2 Remake is far more difficult than its predecessor. In just about every single way, the remake is definitely harder, except, the lack of tank controls with fixed camera angles. But other than that, the remake has got the original beat. The zombies move much quicker. I can't tell you how many times I found myself missing them as they swayed back and forth until they eventually reached me, and yeah, the rest is history. Mr. X becomes a force of nature throughout both playthroughs of the game, unlike the original. And let me tell you, his presence is much more intimidating and he's harder to avoid. The Lickers are probably the creatures that get the biggest spike in difficulty though. In the original, they were fairly easy to dodge and kill. In the remake though, let's just say if you can avoid alerting these guys, you better do it, because they will mess you up quickly. Don't let their blindness fool you. The list goes on. Ivies now have instant kill abilities, and even every single boss fight in this game gives you a run for your money. Hell, 2 of the bosses in this game even made my list for most difficult boss fights in Resident Evil. And there was a 3rd boss fight that I heavily considered putting on the list as well.
You don't know what you're up against.
I have a pretty damn good idea.
Whatever you do, don't stop until it's finished.
Trust me. This ends now.
Do not let your original experience with the original game fool you into believing this one's not going to be that hard. It's a tough experience, and getting through the hardest difficulties in this game is one that takes a lot of effort, especially with no autosave feature on the harder difficulty like some of the other entries in the series. Number 6, Resident Evil Outbreak Files 1 and 2. Resident Evil Outbreak Files 1 and 2. We're basically including both files since these games are essentially 2 halves of the same game. Also, this should be clear by now, but despite the way this game should be played, we're looking at it from a single player experience. Now, Outbreak Files isn't a terribly hard game to complete, especially if you're playing with friends. Just communicate with your buddies and you'll be just fine. It's when you play solo that you see the true difficulty come out. Honestly, with all the heat and hate Sheva's AI gets in Resident Evil 5, I think people easily forget about how horrendous the AI was in Resident Evil Outbreak. Obviously, this game was before its time, but still, the AI made the game much harder than if you had friends playing alongside you. That's because your AI companions in this game usually drain any resources that you allow them to carry. Instead of pulling off dodge maneuvers, you often found them killing everything in their path. Which, if you are a Resident Evil veteran, you would know that this is a bad idea. So a lot of us players found ourselves taking away their resources so that it's not wasted. Unfortunately, this had its own downside. Doing this pretty much left companions defenseless. Therefore, it didn't take long for them to die and leave you all alone in one of the most dangerous Resident Evil games. Another factor that makes this game even more difficult has to do with the fact that, believe it or not, this game features a lot of instant kill enemies. Hunters, tyrants, an axeman, a zombie elephant or zombie lions. Seriously, a lot of these creatures in this game have instant kill attacks. So if you're playing alone and you manage to get your decoys, companions killed early on, then you could be in for some serious trouble later on. Oh, by the way, did I mention that there is a virus gauge? Yeah, unlike Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil Outbreak explains that the longer you are in the city, the more likely you are to become infected. Thanks to the virus gauge, not only do you have to worry about escaping, but you have to do so within a time limit. The gauge moves at different speeds based on your characters, items used, and actions, but just know that if you let the gauge fill up to 100%, then it's game over. Although this is kind of fun during the online mode, because the other players get to deal with the zombie version of you, so I guess that's kind of cool. So basically, limited resources, just like most old school Resident Evil games. A virus gauge that gives you a time limit to complete the mission. AI partners that drain resources and that are best used as decoys. And plenty of instant kill enemies to make the game even more intense. Sounds pretty damn hard to me. Number 5, Resident Evil Revelations.
Hey,
What happened?
I don't think we're alone.
So personally, I like to call this game Resident Evil Bullet Sponge. Seriously, especially on the hardest difficulty, this game has some of the biggest bullet sponge enemies throughout the entire series. After beating this game, I really wondered why no other characters in the franchise used the T-Abyss virus, because after seeing how powerful the enemies were from it, it really seems like the most deadly virus in the series. Anyway, this game introduces a dodge mechanic similar to one that we had in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. However, the mechanic, in my opinion, is hard to time correctly in this game. Unfortunately, learning to use this mechanic is vital if you don't want to blow through your healing resources quickly throughout the game. Obviously, as I've stated already, one reason this game is so hard comes down to the enemies. The creatures infected with the Abyss virus just seem indestructible. They can really take a lot of hits to put down, even a regular enemy. But for the most part, they are fairly manageable. But what I think puts this game to a whole other level of difficulty are the boss encounters. Hell, even one of the first boss fights in this game is easily one of the hardest in the series. The comms officer. This is a creature that you'll come face to face multiple times with. The Skagdead. Unfortunately, this version of the Skagdead is on a whole other level. Like, if you thought enemies up until this point were bullet sponges, then you can assume that this is pretty much the granddaddy of bullet sponge enemies. What makes this guy even more difficult is the combination of his instant kill attacks, his hard to hit weak spot, and the amount of enemies consistently joining the battlefield while you also deal with him. It's a mess. Seriously though, he's not even the worst of it. The final boss is a tyrant that can teleport and make clones of himself. Number 4, Resident Evil 7.
Welcome to the family, son.
Ever heard of the term madhouse? Well, if you're a Resident Evil 7 fan, then you will probably associate that term with hell. Resident Evil 7 is already a fairly hard game to complete. The scare factor making your anxiety throughout this game is already one complication. The limited resources, especially in the first half of Resident Evil 7, make it difficult to take down the enemies you encounter during your first playthrough. And even the boss fights with Marguerite and Jack Baker are undeniably hard to beat even for some of the most experienced Resident Evil gamers. Now let's take it up to a whole new level with a new difficulty called Madhouse Mode. This essentially makes everything that was difficult about your original playthrough even harder. More encounters with Jack Baker throughout the Baker main house.
Heck of a thing, ain't it? Sure shit beats the hell out of dying. My little girl has given us a gift.
Enemies deal a lot more damage. Hell, even the location of specific items and weapons are moved to make the experience a little more unpredictable. Jack Baker's final form will literally demolish you in seconds if you're not careful, and Marguerite will eat you like a bug in her web if you are not cautious. And don't even get me started with the basement and the barn areas. Limited resources become even more scarce, and the fat molded become even more dangerous. Fuck you, Madhouse Mode. Number 3, Resident Evil 3 Remake.
Hello?
Jill, are you okay?
Brad, is that you?
Listen, you gotta get out of there.
What are you talking about?
I don't have time to explain. You gotta get out of there right now.
All right, let me grab my...
So if you've watched other videos of mine, then you would already know my opinion on Resident Evil 3 Remake by now. So let's just get straight to the topic here. If you thought Resident Evil 7's Madhouse Mode would make you tear your hair out in frustration, then let me introduce you to Resident Evil 3 Remake's Inferno Mode. Sure, Inferno doesn't make any changes to the main game like Madhouse does in Resident Evil 7. For the most part, items still remain in the same location and puzzles remain the same. However, just like Madhouse, resources are even more limited. And even more so than Madhouse, you take a ton of damage from enemies compared to other modes. Meaning a lot of the enemies can almost instantly kill you or at least take you down in 2 hits. Actually, even though we said it's against the rules, I would go as far as saying that it's extremely unlikely that you can beat this mode without some medallions to improve ongoing and outgoing damage. Even with these medallions though, beating this mode is no easy task. The encounter with Carlos in the hospital lobby, for example. On Inferno mode, it doesn't take much to put Carlos down. So having to deal with a ton of zombies and hunters coming at you from all different directions makes for one frustrating encounter. However, the boss fights are the points in this game that are really going to make you break your controller out of frustration. See, on Inferno mode's final boss fight with Nemesis, you'll see a somewhat easy boss turn into one of the hardest and most difficult boss fights in the entire series. This fight now involves perfect precision and aiming and perfect timing with dodging his attacks and concentration throughout the entire fight. Lose focus for just one moment and it instantly spells game over. Seriously, timing has never been more important than it is in this fight. And trying to do this without any bonuses? Yeah, good luck with that.
Next time, take the fucking hit!
Number 2, Resident Evil 0.
The Umbrella Research Center?
I honestly can't tell you guys how many Resident Evil fans told me that they tried playing Resident Evil 0 for the first time and they actually gave up out of frustration. Seriously, I didn't realize how difficult this game was until I actually sat down and thought about it from the perspective of someone that didn't grow up with the classics. And when thinking about that and even thinking about which games did I find myself dying the most on my first playthrough, I kept coming back to Resident Evil 0 as one of those games. And it's easy to see why Resident Evil 0 is regarded as one of the most difficult games in the series. For one, limited resources in this game compared to other games is a problem for new players. See, the Resident Evil games have always relied on limited resources. you can't kill every single enemy. If you did, you'll find yourself lacking resources to finish the game completely. With that being said, Resident Evil 0 finds a way to take this element and take it one step farther. Once you get to the training facility, Resident Evil 0 starts forcing the players to backtrack a lot. In doing so, it puts the players in a position to do one of two things when going through the same hallways over and over. Either they run past the enemies, take some damage, and repeat the process when needed, or they put down the enemies for good. But they use up valuable resources in doing that, and in some cases, new enemies will spawn there anyway later on. Now, like I said, this is something Resident Evil is not a stranger to. However, Resident Evil 0 adds one other mechanic that takes it to another level: no item boxes. See, instead of going to an item box like you did in previous games, this time the player needs to drop items they don't need at that moment on the ground. Unfortunately, more often than not, you'll eventually need that item again. But with no magic boxes available, this means that you will have to backtrack all the way back to where you left that key item. In doing so, it means that you will continue to go back and forth until you use a considerable amount of your resources. Sure, a veteran of this game will know when and where to drop specific key items to create less backtracking, but for your first playthrough, this could spell disaster for you early on. Add that to the frustrating new enemies like Eliminators or leached clones of Marcus. Yeah, this game definitely isn't easy for newcomers. Fortunately, the boss fights in this game are easier than other installments of Resident Evil, which just barely keeps Resident Evil 0 from claiming the #1 spot, unlike this next entry. Number 1, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Resident Evil Code Veronica takes the cake for the hardest Resident Evil game. Now, some might disagree, but I like to believe most of us are probably on the same page with this. Actually, if you think back to some of the hardest mechanics and moments in Resident Evil in the Resident Evil franchise, you'll find more often than not, Code Veronica includes some of those features as well. Take everything I said about Resident Evil 0 for example. I mentioned how one of the hardest parts of the game is the amount of backtracking it forces the player to do, therefore using a considerable amount of limited resources early on. Well, Code Veronica does the exact same thing. You'll find yourself backtracking a lot in this game, especially on Rockford Island. I still remember my first playthrough of this game. When I managed to get to my first major boss of the game, I didn't have much ammo to use against him. Therefore, I put myself in a really bad situation, to the point where I just had to restart the game and play it all over again because back then, my dumbass thought that it made perfect sense just to keep saving on the same save file over and over again. Yeah, big mistake, Ruben. Also, some newer enemy types in this game also make things a little more difficult, like the Bandersnatch. These are one of the only enemies in the old school classic Resident Evil games that have long range attacks. Thanks to their extremely long arm, these guys can attack you from the other side of the room. Also, you remember hunters, right? Well, what if we took those same hunters and made them poisonous? That's exactly what we get at the Antarctic base in Code Veronica. And I haven't even touched on the boss fights yet. See, the reason why Resident Evil 0 missed out on the top spot despite having a lot of similar levels of backtracking, limited resources, and difficult enemies comes down to one big difference between the two: the boss fights. Just about every single boss fight in Resident Evil 0 is a cakewalk. That's the opposite of Code Veronica. Literally, almost every single boss in this game has an instant kill attack. Luckily, as long as you keep your distance, most of them are manageable. However, one boss encounter in this stands out as easily top 2 or top 3 territory for the hardest bosses in Resident Evil, the Tyrant fight on the cargo plane. There is very limited room in this boss fight to use to your advantage, and half of the arena puts you in the position to instantly be killed by the Tyrant if you're not careful. Add that to the fact that Rockford Island probably did a good job at draining you of most of your resources before this fight, and you'll find yourself immediately facing some terrible consequences for your actions. Overall though, because of the extremely difficult instant kill boss fights, the amount of backtracking with limited resources, and both enemies and puzzles being more difficult than they were in other games of the series, you'll find that Resident Evil Code Veronica, in my opinion, is the hardest game of the series. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know, which Resident Evil game do you think is the hardest in the series? Do you agree with my choice with Resident Evil Code Veronica, or is there a different one that you think should take the crown? Let me know in the comments below. Oh, and by the way, don't forget, this is the month of October, and because of that, I'm looking for new ideas for ranking videos to celebrate Halloween. So I want to hear some recommendations from you guys. What horror related video would you guys like to see that isn't Resident Evil? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more ranking videos like this one, as well as leaving a like on this video to help your boy out with getting this video out there to as many people as possible. But as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.